Otherwise, we are in 1 Peter chapter 3 tonight. Going to cover verses 1 through 12 in the class as long as time permits, as long as I get that done. We've been doing really well up till now in that we're right on schedule. And that's so unusual in a class that I teach to be right on schedule. But we are right on schedule with the class plans so far. Okay? 1 Peter chapter 3 verses 1 through 12 is what we're going to look at tonight. We're kind of right in the middle of a section here in 1 Peter because we saw in chapter 2, the end of chapter 2, that there are a couple of groups that are addressed specifically. The third group then is in chapter 3, and that's what we're going to get to this evening. But just to kind of go back and repeat ourselves, find where we were so we kind of remember these things. The end of chapter 2 that we talked about on Sunday, we're looking at some of those groups that are addressed. Okay, specifically, there are some accusations that are made against Christians to whom Peter is writing. And where are these Christians located that Peter's writing to? If I wanted to find them on a map, and I was in the first century, where would I find them? Would I find them in Italy? No, I'd find them in Turkey, okay? The area that this letter is being sent to covers a wide area in Turkey. So that's where these folks are located. But there are accusations that are made against Christians. One of the accusations against them was that they were not submitting to rulers. This was a common accusation against Christians in the first century, second century, third century, that they were disloyal to the government. And so Peter addresses that in chapter 2, verses 13 through 17, reminds the Christians how they need to relate to civil authorities. We talked about that last class. The second group that is addressed and the second accusation that is made is that slaves were not submitting. That's chapter 2, verses 18 through 25. So we spent some time talking about that. That's an accusation. I mean, we can understand why these accusations are being made. Because in the Roman Empire, people were expected to participate in the worship in the pagan temples. Christians wouldn't do that, so they were eyed with suspicion. In the Roman Empire, slaves were to obey their masters regardless of what their master commanded. So if the master commanded something evil or immoral, they were still expected to obey that. Obviously, Christians who were slaves would not do that. So we can understand where the accusation comes from, at least in those two groups. Our third group that we're going to look at this evening here in chapter 3 are wives. And the accusation that was made against wives is that they were not submitting. So verses 1 through 6 are going to cover that. But all of these statements that are made, all of these chapters that we have here are directed specifically against these accusations that are being made. We can understand perhaps why the accusation against women, against wives was being made, because these wives would be married, in many cases, to husbands who were not Christians. And so Gentile or pagan husbands might command their wives or require their wives to do some things that were contrary to God's law as well. And so we can understand where the accusation would come from. So Peter is going to address, he's already addressed two of these we've looked at, he's going to address each and every one of these groups, telling disciples in these categories how they needed to behave in their set of circumstances, okay, to alleviate these accusations, but also to encourage them to continue doing what was right. So that's kind of introduction. If there aren't any comments or questions about that, and by the way, Wesley has the microphone tonight. Those of you who are visiting with us, we do live stream this class, and so it's really important if there's a question or a comment that we get a mic to you, and Wesley is our mic guy tonight, so that we get your question or comment in the live stream plus in the auditoriums. It's not always easy to hear. If you have a question or a comment, it's enough to raise your hand and let me know, and we'll get Wesley up to you and we'll go from there. If there aren't any at this point in time, I know this is just introduction, let's go ahead and get into chapter 3 then. We're going to look at verses 1 through 6. Going to read this and spend some time talking about it. So 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1, "Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear. But let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Okay, so these 6 verses specifically address wives. They are specifically addressed to Christian wives. Okay, these are wives who are Christians. No other wives would have been reading this text. By the way, the husbands that are talked about in these 6 verses are going to be what? Non-believing husbands, because believing husbands would have already understood these things and they'd be reading this text. The non-believing husbands are not going to read this. This section, as I've already indicated, is linked to chapter 2, verses 18 through 20, chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. It's addressing some accusations that are made against these specific groups among the Christians that Peter is addressing. Subjection in Peter's letter here has a very practical purpose in this section of the letter. And that practical purpose is bringing unbelieving husbands to Christ. Okay? Peter says that. He says, so that by your conduct, even if they don't obey the word, they may what? Look up there in verse 1 again. They may be won without a word by their conduct. Okay? So Peter's instructions here in this part of the letter are not limited, let me say it differently. Peter's instructions here are not limited to Christian women married to Christian men. That would be true. They're specific to Christian women who are married to unbelieving husbands. And there are other texts that treat this, and so we've got several up there on the screen. I think we have time to at least look at a few of these before we move on the class. So let's go ahead and go over to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5 is another text that addresses wives in the marital relationship. So Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Okay? Same kind of thought that we see expressed there in 1 Peter. You can look at verse 33 since we're there in the chapter anyways. Let's go ahead and look down at that. However, let each one of you, those are the husbands, okay? We're not looking at that intervening passage just yet. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So 2 ideas that are found here in the passage from the wife's standpoint. One is to submit to the husband, and the other is to respect the husband. Okay, and that takes us back, that's parallel to what we saw there in 1 Peter chapter 3. Colossians 3:18 also addresses this relationship. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 2 through 3 also does, as well as 1 Timothy 2, 9 through 15. Let's go ahead and look at that 1 Timothy passage. 1 Timothy chapter 2, 9 down through 15. Likewise also, this is 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9. Likewise also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she shall be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. Again, this is parallel to some aspects of 1 Peter, specifically the adorning there that we'll get to in just a moment. So women, wives, are addressed in several places in the Scripture. Husbands are as well. And husbands are going to be addressed also here in 1 Peter. We'll see that in just a moment. But specifically, the situation is that these were women who were married to non-believing husbands. And they needed to act and behave in a certain way so that they would be able to bring their husbands to the Lord. Okay? If we think about this for just a moment, simply worshiping Jesus would have put the Christian women at odds with social norms in the Roman world. Plutarch, who is a contemporary of these writings, he's living between AD 50 and 120, he said this: "It is becoming for a wife to worship and know only the gods that her husband believes in, and to shut the door tight upon all strange rituals and outlandish superstitions. So in the Roman way of thinking, the wife would worship whatever gods the husband worshiped. Okay? So if the husband likes to worship Zeus and doesn't really care much for worshiping, I don't know, Diana or Athena or whoever, then who is she going to worship in that household? She's going to worship Zeus. She's going to worship the person or the god who her husband worships. So if you've got a woman who becomes a Christian and she's married to a non-Christian, the husband would expect what? You're going to keep worshiping Zeus and you're going to leave Jesus out the door. We're not interested in worshiping Jesus in this house. Okay? This was not an uncommon problem. There are lots of folks today, lots of Christian women who are married to unbelieving husbands. We have some here in this congregation. But in the first century, there would have been the added problem that you had women who were pagan who accepted the gospel of Christ when they were already married. So now they come home to their husband and they say, oh, guess what? I've become a Christian. That wasn't going to go over very well in a lot of households, especially in a society where, we talk about the husband being the head of the house. In Roman society, the husband was the head of the house. We talked a little bit Sunday morning about the fact that when a child was born, until the father accepted the child was not even considered a person under Roman law. Okay? Let that sink in for just a moment. Until the father accepted the child was not considered a person under law. And if the father decided, he looks kind of funny to me. He's funny looking. I don't like him. Or his nose is, I can say that, I got a crooked nose. His nose is a little crooked. Get rid of him. That's exactly what happened. That baby was abandoned. And that's how some of them then ended up in slavery. So under these circumstances, when a woman comes home and says, oh, by the way, I'm a Christian now, that's going to cause difficulties in the household. And so this would cause difficult situations for these Christian women. Now, the New Testament, I would suggest to you, indicates that Christians should not seek marriage to unbelievers. I want to look at these two verses because I think this is something that we don't talk a whole lot about, but it's something that we ought to understand. Look in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 14 through 18. Now, this passage is not speaking directly and specifically about marriage, but it is giving us a principle that I think we would do well to consider when we consider who it is we're going to marry. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership is righteousness with lawlessness, or what fellowship is light with darkness? What accord is Christ with Belial, or what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God, as God said, I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore go out from their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord. Touch no unclean thing, then I will welcome you, and I will be a father to you, and you shall be sons and daughters to me, says the Lord Almighty. The idea of being unequally yoked, okay? The image here is of two animals that are yoked together. You're going to plow the field. You're going to use two animals to do that. Do you yoke together a Clydesdale with a Shetland pony? Not if you want to plow the field. Okay, it's going to be unequal in how those two animals work together. You're going to find two animals that are more or less equals in that ability. You're not going to use an oxen and a donkey, or an oxen and a horse, okay? You're not going to use a goat and a horse because it's unequally yoked. That's the image that's used here. And the text says that Christians are not to be unequally yoked with who? With unbelievers, okay? Now, again, not specifically talking about marriage, but I think there is a principle there. That we as Christians, especially as Christians who are unmarried, who are contemplating marriage, should think about and should be aware of. Our other passage is 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 39. This is a passage that speaks directly to marriage. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 39 This is what Paul writes. He said, I'll give you time to find that, 1 Corinthians 7, verse 39. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Okay? I think that passage specifically speaks to the situation of marriage. I mean, how can you avoid that? You've got a woman whose husband dies. She's freed from that husband. Okay, she was bound to him as long as he lived. But if the husband dies and she gets remarried, which was very common in the ancient world, as it is even today, that remarriage should be where? In the Lord. My understanding of that passage is that Paul is saying a Christian, not an unbeliever. Now think about this for just a minute. If these women, and many of these women had been, if they had been married to an unbeliever, and that's a terribly difficult set of circumstances, okay? That husband dies, she's going to get remarried. What is Paul saying? You got out of one situation, don't get yourself into the same situation. When you marry another unbeliever, well, then you're going to be in that situation again. Okay? Now, I understand. I don't want anybody to throw rocks at me. I understand people can be brought to the Lord. That's exactly what Peter's talking about here. That women, by their behavior, can win their husbands without a word, okay? By their behavior. There's an evangelistic aspect to that. But I also know and have seen far too many times that when dad is an unbeliever, mom is a believer, or vice versa, that many times the unbelieving, or I should say differently, many times the believing spouse is pulled away, and many times the children don't grow up to believe. It's hard enough to get children to grow up and accept Christianity when both parents are Christians. It's even harder when there's a split household, if you will. Okay, so I think we get these passages here. Again, I'm not going to be dogmatic about it, but that's where I think God's Word comes down on this issue. And young people should weigh that very carefully when choosing who they're going to marry. Still looking at 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, Peter tells these women that they are to have respectful or fearful, if you will, depending upon your translation, and pure conduct that is appropriate before God. Then he talks about external adorning, and he lays that out in contrast with internal adorning. Now, I'm going to give you my take on this. You can disagree with me if you'd like. That's perfectly fine. What's important is that you be convinced by what the Scriptures say and your understanding of it. I don't believe here that Paul is condemning braiding of hair, gold jewelry, as such. Because he also says they're not to wear what? Clothing. Okay? In this passage. Now, Paul specifies and says that it's expensive clothing, okay, or luxurious clothing. I don't think he's condemning that as such. What he is condemning here is that those things, or what he's saying here, not really condemning, is that those things should not be the emphasis in a woman's life. Look with me if you would. Hold your spot there in 1 Peter. Let's go over to Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 22. Proverbs 11 and verse 22. I love this passage. Proverbs 11 and verse 22. Like a gold ring and a pig's snout. Picture that for just a second. Like a gold ring and a pig's snout is a beautiful woman without discretion. You would no more put a gold ring in your pig, right? A nose ring in your pig than a beautiful woman should be without discretion. The emphasis in the passage is what? What's better, the external or the internal? The internal is what's important, okay? So it is better to be a woman with discretion, because a beautiful woman that doesn't have discretion is like putting that golden ring in a pig's snout. It just doesn't go together. The emphasis here in 1 Peter, and you can go back to that text if you'd like to, the emphasis here in 1 Peter is on character, that they're to have a gentle and quiet spirit that is in subjection to their husbands. Sarah is given as an example. How did Sarah address Abraham? as Lord, okay? By the way, that's coming out of Genesis chapter 18 and verse 12. You can see that specifically that's exactly what she did. Right? Does that mean that wives today need to address their husbands as Lord? No, but they should act as if they are, right? It's talking about respect. It's talking about that character. All right, so I did want to share with y'all some photographs because, quite honestly, in the ancient world, hairstyles could be very elaborate. And women, a lot of women, took a lot of time to make them very elaborate. And so I pulled some pictures that kind of demonstrate this. And so you can see all those very elaborate. I like the one there with the red background. Okay? That just strikes me that would have taken an awful lot of time to get that together and get that to stay right where it is. But even the one on the top left would look that way with all of that braiding. Okay? Hairstyles were often very elaborate, especially among which classes? The wealthy classes, okay? Placing a lot of emphasis on the external. Is it any different today? No, okay? Usually wealthy classes place a great deal of emphasis on the externals, all right? There was an article, I was on the internet today or yesterday, and there was an article on Yahoo about wedding dresses and about the average price of wedding dresses. And I think the average price of a wedding dress in America today is, anybody want to take a guess? About $1,900 is the average. But then they were showing celebrities who had dresses that were thousands and thousands of dollars. Okay, you may have heard on the radio recently about the $59 million wedding. Did y'all hear about that? I don't know who these folks were, but they wanted to get married in France. They wanted to get married at Versailles in France. And they wanted all their guests to come. So they chartered a private jet and flew a bunch of people over to France. And they rented the Palace of Versailles for their ceremony. And then they had some performer come in and perform. And then they had some special restaurant. I don't know what restaurant they had. But the bill for all of that was $59 million for a wedding. It's pretty ostentatious, isn't it? That kind of thing, I think, is what Peter is addressing here. That if you're emphasizing the externals, you're missing the point. What's important is what's on the inside. Okay? Especially in this context of winning your husbands to Christ. That's 1 Peter 3, verses 1 through 6. Any questions or comments about that? Wesley is bored over there. The poor guy doesn't ever get to walk around with a mic. All right, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7 then. Let's read this. Let's see. 1 Peter, I'm in the wrong place. Give me a second to get there. 1 Peter 3, 7. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. So now, and in one verse, Peter addresses Christian husbands, not non-believing husbands. Why not? They wouldn't be reading it anyways, and they really, quite honestly, couldn't possibly care less what Peter had to say anyways. Okay? So he's addressing here in a very short way, and it makes sense because it's right in the section with the wives. Christian men who are either married to Christian women or unbelieving women. The instructions are valid in either case. It wasn't just unbelieving women it wasn't just believing women who had unbelieving husbands. Sometimes it was believing husbands who had unbelieving wives. Okay? And the instructions that are given here, we have several words that require some special attention. So I just wanted to pull these up in a chart. The first of those terms is, or it's a phrase I guess I should say, is in an understanding way. So they are to live with their wives in an understanding way. Okay? It is a command, by the way. That word live there is an imperative. It's a command. So Peter is not saying, husbands, think about it. No, he's saying, husbands, this is what you need to do. Okay? It's a command. Live with your wives according to knowledge is literally what the text there is telling us. I would suggest to you that probably what Peter has in mind is that they are to live in a way according to knowledge, specifically knowledge of God's will in this regard. So, let's go back to Ephesians 5. Because we've talked a lot about the women, let's talk a little bit about the men. Ephesians chapter 5. Verses 25 through 33, that's that big section we did not read because it addressed husbands. Okay? Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, gave himself up for her that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. And then we have verse 33 that we already read. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So God has revealed some things about the husband's responsibility in the relationship. And Peter, in telling these husbands there to dwell with their wives in an understanding way, is you need to dwell with them according to God's instructions. Okay, we won't read Colossians 3:19 because we read the text here in Ephesus. The other term that we should note here, the second term that we should note here, is that they are to show their wives honor. This phrase encompasses the idea of estimation, price, value, or honor. It's putting, and don't misunderstand me, it's putting a price tag on someone or on something. I drive a Kia. Honestly, I'm not terribly concerned about anybody stealing a Kia. Until they had this TikTok thing where they showed people how you could break into a Kia without the key or whatever. I don't know. And then there was a whole, did you know that Kias are now the most stolen cars in America? They're stolen by teenagers from this TikTok whatever, okay? Up until then, I wasn't concerned about anybody stealing my Kia. Now, if I had a Rolls Royce, my Kia is parked on my driveway, not in my garage. If I had a Rolls Royce, that car would be in the garage because it's more valuable. And I would recognize that. What Peter is telling husbands here is we need to show honor. You need to show honor according to the estimation, price, value that your wives have. Husbands should value their wives. And by the way, no husband should ever think their wife is a Kia. A Rolls Royce or a Mercedes or a Peugeot, not a Peugeot, a Porsche or whatever. Not a Kia. That's what I drive, okay? I drive a Kia, but my wife's not a Kia. By any stretch of the imagination. So Peter commands husbands to show value to their wives. The third word here that we should note is this phrase, weaker vessel. That's a very literal translation of what the Greek there says. Women are not weaker morally or intellectually. That's not what Peter's saying. Women, however, do have physical weakness in general comparison to males. Now, I know there are exceptions, okay? There are women bodybuilders that could squash me like a bug. I understand that. But in general, women are physically weaker than men. I grew up in a generation, you don't do what? You don't hit a woman. Make no mistake, the younger generation is not being raised that way. Okay? And sometimes the girls, I see this in middle school, sometimes the girls are tougher than the guys. Okay? But it didn't matter. We were raised, don't hit a woman. Don't ever hit a woman. Okay? Who are most often the victims of crime? Women are. From men. Men are most often the perpetrators. Women are most often the victim. I'm walking into the Walmart parking lot at 11 o'clock at night. I got to tell you, I'm not terribly concerned about somebody messing with me because I'm a big guy, okay? I don't let my wife go to Walmart at 11 o'clock at night by herself. I just don't, okay? Because there's more of a likelihood of somebody doing something to her on that parking lot than doing something to me. And even less likelihood if we go together. So these are phrases that Peter uses for husbands in regards to their wives. Dwell with them in an understanding way, showing honor to them as the weaker vessel. The idea here is one of protection and honor and treating them in a way like you would treat something that is fragile, right? Not that women are fragile. Ladies, please do not misunderstand me. But they are more fragile than men in this regard. Generally speaking. Okay. The reason for the injunctions that are given to live according to God's will and show honor to the wife is stated here in the text. They are heirs of the grace of life, just like their husbands. Galatians chapter 3, verse 28 says that, as does 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 4. And also so that the husband's prayers, will not be hindered. Okay, Matthew chapter 5, 23 through 24 also. We could look at that. We're not going to do that right now. So husbands are also addressed here in the text. All right, that's kind of a section. That's verses 1 through 7. That gets us beyond that section where we have the three groups that are addressed. So now I'm going to stop. We're going to break for just a second and see if we can get Wesley up off that chair over there with his microphone for questions or comments. This is a tough crowd. I got to tell you, this is a tough crowd. Oh, boy. Good teacher. No, it's a tough crowd. Those of you who have been in my classes, you know I like discussion. I don't know. I can't get much discussion. Here we go. Wesley. Yes, Sean. Sean and Rebecca are visiting with us tonight. Sean?
Yeah. So you have a note here of Matthew 5, 23, 24.
Uh-huh.
But that doesn't address the husband's prayers not being hindered. That's 1 Peter 3, 7. Likewise.
Sure is. You're absolutely right. I wrote the wrong reference there.
So I just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page there.
Absolutely. Y'all can scratch that out. And what's the reference you're going to give us? If you'll say that out loud again.
1 Peter 3, 7.
1 Peter 3, 7. Okay.
And in relation to this weaker vessel, my wife will laugh at me. I just did a sermon on this not too long ago. Proverbs 31 is where we go to very frequently for the ideal woman. Mm-hmm. And we see between those verses the ideal man. He's encouraging, he's edifying, he's praising her, he's helping build her up. Without her doing what she's supposed to be doing, he can't be the man he's supposed to be either. The weaker vessel, I think you hit it on right. It's just physical. But even then, it's not inferior or fragile. I mean, she's still a strong woman, right? That 31 example, she's going and buying and selling. She's planting vineyards. The woman is capable. The woman is very capable. And I want to make sure that anybody who's watching on the stream doesn't come away with thinking that we think men are the end-all, be-all. God made us together. We're partners. But that was all.
I think that's an excellent comment. Thank you for correcting Matthew 5, 23 through 24. That is obviously not the right reference. I must have had a senior moment or an almost senior moment when I put that in there. I agree. We look at Proverbs chapter 31. That's a text that we frequently go to. We didn't in the class tonight. But you see, she gets up early in the morning. She makes sure her household is taken care of. She plants a vineyard. She is very busy and capable in her own right. So I again emphasize, I do think that what's being talked about here in Peter is the general physical aspect of the difference between the two. Okay? I mean, what do we got going on in our society today? We've got a situation where women who are in sports do not want trans men participating in women's sports. Why is that? Because they're stronger. And what ends up happening, I mean, we've had some pretty good cases of it, public cases of it, where a trans man actually takes first place. Okay? There's an advantage over the woman. And so now there's a lot of women in sports who obviously don't want men, biological males, talked about that Sunday night in the lesson, biological males participating against them in sports. I hate to say it's just biology. It's just biology. It's a biological fact, okay, of who we are. It's certainly not to say that women are inferior and not that women can't take pain. Those of you that have given birth have taken plenty of pain, I suppose. I cannot relate to that directly. Only having been a witness to the 3 births of our children. But that's probably, some of us guys might, I don't know whether we'd survive that or not, childbirth. So good point. Thank you, Sean, for making that point. All right. Any other questions or comments? Okay. If we'll come over here, Wesley. Wesley's headed your way with the microphone.
Not that there's anything wrong with this, but there are a lot of men that do not like women to participate in sports because of their pride. I'm just saying.
No question about that. Many men have an issue with pride. I'm reminded of that meme that I saw on it was on Facebook, but it was a picture of a billboard, and it's so many men will die from pride or something to that effect, or procrastination, and then somebody spray painted underneath it, "No, we won't." Okay, yeah, we men tend to be a little hard-headed, a little bit proud. All right, so we've got one more section here in 1 Peter chapter 3 to cover. It's verses 8 through 12. Let's go ahead and read that, spend a little time talking about it, and that should wrap up the class for the evening. Finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless. For to this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. For whoever desires to love life and see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. So we have here in these verses a listing of some attitudes and actions that will result in a blessing from God. The end result is then given to us in verse 9. If you look at the very end of verse 9, these things are done that you may obtain a blessing. There are 5 attitudes and there are 2 actions that are found here in the text. So let's look at the attitudes that are here. The first of those is in verse 8. Have unity of mind. In a Christian world, in a hostile world, Christians need to have what? They need to have unity. They need to stick together. Okay? Most of you know, some of you may not, but my wife is Czech, like really Czech, from the Czech Republic, Czech. Say Czech in Texas, everybody thinks, oh, well, they just live down in the West, right? No, she's not from West. Her parents were opposed to our wedding until the day of our wedding. I mean, her mom was really opposed to the wedding, okay? And her dad was pretty opposed too. How in the world I lived to the day of the wedding, I'm not sure. But I managed to survive to the day of the wedding. And we got married. And on the day of the wedding, everything changed. Night and day. Because in Czech culture, if you're not in the family, you're a stranger. But once you're in the family, you're family. And there is a border drawn around that. Okay? So once we actually got the wedding done, then Mom and Dad kind of decided they liked me a little bit after all. Okay? And her dad and I became very good friends in the time that I lived over there. Christians need to have that kind of unity because the world around us is a hostile world. And so Peter, in writing to these disciples, we're going to note this later in the letter, a lot of what he's writing here is because these Christians are going to they've already had some persecution, they're going to have it worse. You need to have unity of mind. It's important for us as Christians to have unity of mind. By the way, one of those things that really hurts our witness to the world around us is when we do what? We argue, we split. So you can go to some little tiny Texas towns that don't have that many people living there anyways. And here's Church of Christ A and here's Church of Christ B. Why is there Church of Christ A and Church of Christ B? Because somewhere in the past, somebody got mad about something and they went over and started another church. It had nothing to do with doctrine. I remember this. Tim's up here so I can say this. I used to worship down in Lancaster. There are two churches in Lancaster. One's on Dallas Avenue and the other is on Pleasant Run. Both of them are great. Well, in the day. I don't know if they are today, but they were in the day. Great groups of Christians. So why were there two? Literally 5 minutes apart on the road. Because somewhere in the past, somebody got mad at somebody else and a group left and started another church. Not over a doctrinal issue. Do we have any concept of how the world views that? And what they think about us when we do that? Peter says you need to have unity of mind. Obviously, if there are doctrinal issues, okay? If we get 25 people here who want to bring a piano here on Sunday, guess what? Those 25 people are going to have to go somewhere else with their piano, okay? Not talking about doctrinal issues. Talking about issues where it's just personalities, people got mad. People weren't unified in their mind, okay? People didn't know how to forgive one another for slights and problems, whatever it may have been. Unity of mind, especially in a hostile world. He also tells them another attitude there to have, all of these are in verse 8. Another attitude there to have is the attitude of sympathy. Sympathy is deep care about the needs, joys, sorrows of others, Schreiner says in his commentary. You can read in regard to this Romans chapter 12 and verse 15. You can also read 1 Corinthians 12:26. We won't. You have the references. You can look at them later. Sympathy. The ability to relate to others. The ability to have deep care for others. That's important for us as Christians. Also, here, they need to have brotherly love. Talks about the bonds of a spiritual family. Okay? We should think of each other as family. Brothers and sisters in Christ. I have a couple of brothers and a sister. Do you think I ever, growing up, had arguments with my brothers and my sister? Yeah, I did. I was the run of the litter. They did all sorts of nasty things to me. They did. My sister used to dress me up when I was a baby. Thankfully, that was before digital cameras, and so those were probably burned somewhere long ago. That's what brothers and sisters do, but they're still brothers and sisters. Okay? I love my brothers and my sister. I would do anything for them. That's the kind of attitude we need to have as Christians. When we look at other Christians as being strangers instead of family, we're going to have problems. My brother does something to me and that I don't like. You know what happens? I probably tell him what I think about that. But he's still my brother. I still love him. Christians, do I ever irritate any of y'all? Don't raise your hand. Don't nod so quickly. Sam, you don't count. You're my son. Okay. Do I ever irritate somebody in the church? I'm sure I do. Do you ever irritate anybody else in the church? I'm sure you do. Okay. Do you ever irritate me? Sometimes you do. Okay. But we're what? We're family. Brotherly love. Okay. We need to have that attitude. A tender heart also is listed here in verse 8. Compassion is a mark of the Christian. Okay. We see sympathy. Tender heart is very similar to that. It's kind of like trying to define the difference between the English words sympathy and compassion. But the idea is caring for one another. And then our fifth attitude here is that we are to have a humble mind. We consider others to be more important than ourselves. Philippians 2 verses 3 and 4. Romans chapter 12 and verse 16. Okay, talk about that. I should stop with that bell. I don't want to stop with that bell. So give me a second. I want to read Philippians chapter 2 verses 3 and 4. And then I'll stop. We're a little bit behind. Not concerned about that. We'll pick it up on Sunday. Okay. So Philippians 2, when I get my Bible to the right place. Verses 3 and 4. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, But in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. Verse 5 is not on the sheet. This is what I wanted us to read. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. If we ever wonder what it means as disciples to have humble minds, it's enough to look to Jesus. If we take his example, that will guide us in how we interact with other Christians in humility. Okay, if you're marking in your papers, mark right there, because we're going to pick up right here on that slide that starts with those two actions right there. Sunday morning, just a little bit to finish up here in this chapter, and we will move right on in to the next section in 1 Peter. But so that you know what that is, so that you have that read, let me jump down to that slide. It's actually one slide away. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 13 through 22. Okay, that's what I need you to read for Sunday morning. We'll finish up this and do that class as well.